Hello, Bobby KSP Thinker here, and in this video, I would like to discuss one of my all-time favorite X-Men villains of all time, besides Magneto, Apocalypse. And Apocalypse, I find, is rather commonly misunderstood by fans and media outside the comics alike. So I would like to clear up a few things about Apocalypse. First of all, Apocalypse is technically not a social Darwinist. The reason being he was born long before Darwin, and those um, those traditions in history were tribal traditions that were later adapted by eugenicists and the and occultists and idealistic reactionaries and the like. So, um, yeah, Apocalypse is technically not a social Darwinist. Furthermore, Apocalypse is a lot more morally gray than a lot of people realize. Um, and, um, and, if you, and I highly recommend that you, check out, comic book arcs such as, The 12, as well as, Apocalypse's, earliest appearances in the X Factor comics, and as well as several of his later appearances in X Force, to see just how complex Apocalypse truly is, and just how deeply wrong media tends to get him. Also, Apocalypse Apocalypse's philosophy is very much shaped by his environment. He grew up in ancient Egypt under very harsh conditions, and he was adopted by a slave named Baal, who gave him his name and Sabanur, which translates to the first one. At least that's what the comic says. In reality, it's closer to something along the lines of Morning Light, but in story, that's the translation. And Apocalypse is generally considered to be the first mutant. Now, I say generally because in the comics it's a little up in the air, and there's a lot of and there's a lot of sort of continuity with wingding stuff about who's older, Selene or Apocalypse, and it gets a little confusing. But yeah, so Apocalypse was named Ansabanor by Baal because evolution had not been discovered yet at the time, and so they didn't know what mutants were, so they basically saw Apocalypse as a god, and of course the pharaoh Rama-Tut, who was secretly the future dictator and longtime Avengers foe, King the Conqueror in disguise, or at least one of King's other incarnations in the timeline. And yeah, so Rama-Tut tried to kill the baby Ansabanor, but Baal saved him, and taught him about survival of the fittest and the ways of Clan Akaba, and taught him swordsmanship and how to build up his frail body in combat and things of this nature. And over time, Ansabanor would internalize these teachings of Clan Akaba to such an extent that he basically made it his guiding philosophy throughout his life. And this would eventually feed into his obsession to become the strongest being. And another thing that people tend to get wrong about Apocalypse quite frequently is that Apocalypse is so committed to survival of the fittest that if he dies in combat, he doesn't really care. Because in his mind, if might is right is the absolute moral truth of the universe, and so he